Department of History faculty at Auburn, and he began teaching there in 1968. And Alan is currently working on finishing up our own bicentennial history, which is forthcoming to this fall on St. Matthew's Day. Hopefully, I'll be watching out for that. So Alan is going to use his big voice.
Yeah, I guess.
We're sorry that the microphone.
Well, I think I've had enough experience addressing students, unruly students sometimes. And I'd also like to thank Elaine for putting together the images. It's amazing how many images the Archives and History Committee has collected over the, 12 years since the existence of the formation of the Archives Committee, and how Elaine is able to find these images on her computer is even more amazing. You should see when she pulls up her screen, it's just filled with all kinds of icons. Anyway, just to begin with, let me just give you a quick thumbnail history of the founding of the original St. Matthew's Parish and Church. The North Carolina Colonial General Assembly established St. Matthew's Parish in Orange County in 1752. 5 years later, the vestry obtained a 1-acre plot of land, lot 98, at the corner of what is now Churton and Tryon Street in Hillsborough. It's where the Presbyterian Church is now. In order to strengthen royal authority and to establish the Church of England in the Piedmont area, Governor William Tryon dispatched Parson George Micklejohn as rector of St. Matthew's Parish in April of 1767, pardon me. In the following year, an Anglican church arose on that lot, and that, in a nutshell, is how St. Matthew's came to be. Well, let's back up a bit to earlier in fact, a couple of centuries earlier. But in the mid-18th century, this part of North Carolina, the Piedmont, was just opening up for settlement by Europeans, mostly English, Scottish, and Germans. There were Anglicans, Presbyterians, a lot of Quakers, and Moravians. The indigenous people who had inhabited the land for millennia were now pretty few in number. Contact with Europeans, the explorers and traders, and then finally some settlers, resulted in large numbers of native people perishing from diseases, mainly smallpox, but other diseases as well. Mortality rates vary. Anywhere from 50 to 90% of the indigenous people died from diseases that they first encountered from Europeans and from Africans, slaves as well. Europe and Africa had such close contact over the centuries that there was a common disease pool for those two continents, but the Native Americans had never had contact with many of the diseases that Europeans and Africans had. The explorers and traders and settlers came into the Piedmont area from the south and from the north. There were there are no rivers running east and west, at least navigable rivers running east and west, so that there was very little settlement coming from the coastal plain until later in the 18th century. The first Europeans to penetrate into the interior of the Southeast were the Spanish. Even before Walter Raleigh and the Lost Colony, Spaniards had established strongholds on the Atlantic coast from South Carolina down to Florida. Hernando de Soto's expedition reached western North Carolina in 1540. In 1556 and 1557, another Spanish explorer, Juan Pardo, led two expeditions from the coast through South Carolina into North Carolina. He established forts along the way, one near Morganton that is being excavated by archaeologists today. Pardo's expedition probably came by Salisbury, that far east. It's not clear exactly well, we know where his forts were, but he obviously had sort of meandered around into the interior of North Carolina. The earliest known English-sponsored expedition to travel down the great Indian trading path into the Piedmont was John Lederer. Lederer was a German. He was a physician. He was engaged by the governor of Virginia, William Barclay, to try to find a way across the mountains to the ocean beyond the mountains. They thought it was just a couple of days beyond these mountains, and they would find the Western Ocean, or what we would know now as the Pacific, and of course they would find their way on to to Asia with its riches of spices and so forth. Lederer made 3 of these journeys, these expeditions, and it's the second one that is of the most interest to us. On his second expedition, he passed through what would become Hillsborough. He came down the Great Indian Trading Path, which ran right out here along St. Mary's Road, on down to the river. And it was there at the river. The reason a settlement of Indians and later Europeans came and established settlement here in Hillsborough is because there was an easy ford across the river. Towns and settlements were established along rivers, particularly places where there was an easy ford, an easy way across to the other side. In his account of these expeditions, Lederer gave a vivid description of the Enoch people who lived here. Enoch is a word that appears on his map, O-E-N-O-C-K, or Eno, or Haynoch. There are a lot of varieties of spellings, but Enoch appears on his map. He spent a couple of days with the Enochs. He had a rather lengthy description of the Enoch people. He commented that they were industrious people. They were good farmers. They built their houses out of watling and plaster instead of out of bark. He was particularly impressed with their vigorous sports, especially what he called the slinging of stones. An even better known early account of North Carolina was written by John Lawson, who wrote his account of his travels through the Carolinas is called A Voyage to Carolina, published in London in 1709. And Lawson's account, among the few other accounts that were published at about that time, that informed Europeans about the Carolinas and how suitable it would be for settlement, for farming, and for the naval stores and pine trees and so forth that was so much in demand by the English Navy. Lawson was also a founder of Newbern, along with a Swiss baron, de Graffenried, who they collaborated in laying out and laying out Newbern and attracting settlers. Lawson had the misfortune well, actually, both de Graffenried and Lawson were captured by the Tuscarora Indians. De Graffenried was let go. Lawson was not so fortunate, and he was murdered by the Tuscarora Indians. Anyway, his account came to be quite well known in England and in the rest of Europe. Lederer's account was not as well known. It was written in Latin and later translated into English and other European languages. The royal charters of the late 17th century clearly envisioned the establishment of an Anglican church in North Carolina. There were several vestry acts passed by the North Carolina legislature in the early 1700s that provided for the election of vestries, the building of churches, and a poll tax to support the Anglican clergy. Dissenters, mainly the Quakers and the Presbyterians, really resisted these measures because they discriminated against the dissenting religions. Later in the century, later in the 1700s, these dissenters would be known as the regulators, who rebelled against the royal government, and recently founded Hillsborough would be at the epicenter of the regulator unrest, as we will see in a minute. In the early decades of the 18th century, North Carolina was one of the most thinly populated of the colonies, especially west of the coastal plain. Various pieces of legislation encouraged immigration. For example, the North Carolina legislature forgave debts. There was a moratorium on taxation. If people would come to North Carolina, come to the Carolinas, they would be free of taxation for 10 years. One of the acts was for 10 years, another one for 13. And people began coming in. Obviously, the word was getting around that no taxation, it's plenty of land, thinly populated, well, because the indigenous people had died off, for one thing. The years between 1729, when North Carolina became a royal colony instead of a proprietary colony, between 1729 and 1775, there was rapid population growth. Between 1750 and 1775, North Carolina's population grew from 50,000 people to 265,000, of which about 80,000 were enslaved persons. It was during the mid-18th century that what became Orange County saw new settlers arriving from the northern colonies, some from South Carolina, and some even directly from Europe. The two principal roads by which settlers arrived from the north were the great Indian trading path that is number 10 on the map here. And then the Philadelphia Great Wagon Road, that is the main red line from Philadelphia down to Augusta, Georgia. I'd always wondered why, how do you pronounce Rowan County? I always get it wrong. Somebody always corrects me. Okay, anyway, that county, I grew up in Eastern North Carolina, and I never learned how to pronounce that county, just like some people don't know how to pronounce Corolla or Corolla. So anyway, the two roads intersect near what's now Salisbury, which would explain why that area developed as early as it did, contemporaneously with Orange County and Hillsborough. Among those settlers arriving in Orange County was the Cain family, sometimes spelled with an E, sometimes mostly not, C-A-I-N. The Cains, whose descendants were firmly entwined in the lives of both St. Mary's and St. Matthew's. Hugh and James Cain arrived in Orange County sometime during the 1750s. Hugh's son, William Sr., William I, became a prominent planter and a member of the legislature. He accumulated more than 4,000 acres, making him the largest landowner in Orange County at the time. And some 95 enslaved persons lived on his plantation at Pleasant Grove. An interesting footnote about William Cain, this is William Cain Sr. In 1799, he petitioned the court to set free a slave named Africa. This free man, who took the name Africa Parker, he was now a free man, he formed a partnership with Thomas Watts to operate a distillery on Lot 30 in Hillsborough. I mean, he was a talented man and much in demand to be making whiskey. So this relationship between the two was described in court records as, quote, a co-partnership and joint trade in the art, mystery, and business of a distiller. And it's probably the state legislature wouldn't allow it now. Lot 30 is right up here on King Street, right across from the post office. So anyway, Africa Parker was very active, and obviously it was a very profitable arrangement between him and Mr. Watts. Yes.
Is that Cain family? Is that the same family as the Moorhead Cain Scholarship at UNC? Do you know? I'm just curious.
I don't know for a fact. I think probably, there's some relationship. William Sr. had a son, William Jr., and he married Judge Thomas's sister. Okay, and he was one of the charter signers of St. Matthew, of the refounding of St. Matthew's in 1824, and he was on several vestries. His son, William Cain III, died very young, and then there's William Cain IV, who was he died a bachelor in 1930, and was a very distinguished mathematician and civil engineer on the faculty at UNC. So, I mean, although the line of William Keynes comes to an end with William IV, I mean, there would be other Keynes in the area. And of course, I mean, and they were quite well to do. So I'm guessing. Yeah. Anyway, William Kane Jr., William Kane III, and William Kane IV are all interred in the churchyard. We don't know where the original William Kane is interred, probably on his plantation at Pleasant Grove somewhere. But anyway, it's never been located. Yeah. As the population of the Piedmont increased, royal governors were intent on strengthening the authority of the crown and establishing the supremacy of the Church of England. And to further these goals, St. Matthew's Parish in Orange County were created in 1752. Governor William Tryon dispatched George Micklejohn as rector of St. Matthew's Parish in April of 1767. Just newly arrived rectors received 20 pounds the first year, and if they receive another 20 pounds if they stayed a second year. What was happening? A lot of rectors were coming to North Carolina and finding, well, first place, there weren't a whole lot of enthusiastic Episcopalians. There were certainly not very many enthusiastic taxpayers who were willing to support these Anglican rectors and to build churches and to build fine palaces for the governor and so forth. This is the regulator side of the story that we'll come to. But Micklejohn was born in Scotland. He was ordained in 1764. 2 years later, he was one of 6 Church of England missionaries sent to North Carolina by the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel in Foreign Parts. Governor Tryon initially sent Micklejohn to that county whose name I can't pronounce, but within a few months he was out of there and here in Orange County. And much of Micklejohn's life is shrouded in mystery. The person, many of you know this, but the person who has delved into Micklejohn's life is our own Bob Ireland. Bob is arguably the world's leading authority on Parson Micklejohn, and I have borrowed heavily from his work. Fortunately, I have received permission. I saw him in church last Sunday, and I received his blessings to plagiarize his work as much since plagiarism seems to be in the air these days. I thought I'd better clear this up, that I've got permission to do this, and I fully recognize that what I'm doing is plagiarism. So, for example, I mean, I'm just going to list some items that about Micklejohn that are iffy. Was Micklejohn born in 1717 or 1734? It's quite a difference. Yeah. Did he marry before coming to North Carolina as well as after? Did his first wife desert him? Was he in the Duke of Cumberland's army at the Battle of Culloden, in which the English trounced the Scots? Was he a chaplain in the army of Prussia's Frederick the Great? According to tradition, he loved fine, fast horses. and he loved a wee dram or two. According to tradition, he carried a flask in his saddlebag, and he actually used it to bribe reluctant Anglicans to come to church, with, offering them a little drink or two. Was he really so covetous of his money that he only accepted gold coins for performing weddings and funerals? Did he really keep his money in a money belt tied tightly around his waist? One tradition says his wife in England, so supposedly he had a wife, once had a wife in England, the first one. Supposedly she ran off with another man and all of his money. So he was always somewhat suspicious of women in general, as we'll see. There's also a story about his entrusting his money to his friend John Norwood. Norwood was a judge, and he had ties to the St. Mary's and St. Matthew's. Anyway, Mickle John was going on a trip, and he gave his money belt to John Norwood to keep for him until he got back. And Mickle John returned. John Norwood wasn't at home when Mickle John arrived to pick up his money belt, but his wife was. And she said, hang on a minute, I'll go get it for you. And she went and got his money belt, brought it back. Mickle John was so suspicious, he opened up his money belt and counted his coins and counted them again and counted them again to make sure that she hadn't pinched a coin or two. And he was so excited that she hadn't taken any of his coins, he jumped up and said, my woman, you're certainly an honest woman. Again, whether that's true or not, but presumably he was pretty much of a tightwad. He was Scots after all, wasn't he? I mean, anyway, what we do know for sure is that a year after Mickle John arrived in Hillsborough, a church arose. A church was built in 1768, and he was the first permanent rector installed at St. Matthew's Parish. Brooks had some very salient observations about the architectural features of the church. The fact that St. Matthew's Church was the largest building in the Piedmont. It was 70 feet long and 30 feet wide and capable of seating nearly 200 people. How many people does the current church would it hold if you were jammed in? I mean, 200 people in that church. I mean, it was a pretty sizable building. That the church, the original St. Matthew's, signaled the supremacy of the authority of the crown and the ecclesiastical authority of the Church of England. The arrangement of the pews and the elevated height of the pulpit, not all the pews faced the pulpit and the altar, meaning that the church was an auditory church, one for hearing the word. The larger pews, of course, were reserved for, as you would imagine, the elite members of society. The clock is the clock given to St. Matthew's by the king, King George III, is the only surviving artifact from the original St. Matthew's and now resides on the cupola atop the old Orange County Courthouse. When Meiklejohn arrived in 1767, Hillsborough was at the center of the regulator unrest in the Piedmont. The regulators were largely small farmers and tradesmen who regarded the royal government with contempt. They resented the taxation to pay for Anglican churches and Anglican rectors. I was curious about where the word regulator came from, and I did a little digging around. It's a term that was used first in the English Civil War back in the 1660s. And a regulator was an official who investigated abuses of power. And so the regulators regarded themselves as obviously resisting the abuse of power by the royal government. Meiklejohn was walking a real tightrope in this regulator conflict. On the one hand, he seems to have had fairly good relations with the regulators, and he was not opposed to many of their demands. On the other hand, he opposed violence, and I think probably more importantly, he, after all, he owed his position in Hillsborough to the royal governor, Tryon. So he was kind of caught in the middle. Tryon brought a militia to Orange County to confront the regulators in 1768. And when he did, he called upon Meiklejohn to preach a sermon to the troops. And the title of this sermon, I think, gives you a pretty good idea of why Tryon would like Meiklejohn pretty well. On the important duty of subjection to the civil powers. It seems that, well, it's clear that Meiklejohn plagiarized this sermon. It had been preached about a decade earlier in England in the aftermath of a failed rebellion in England. And it's pretty much word for word. Comparing that, anyway, it was probably a lot easier nobody would ever know the difference, right? I mean, this sermon had been preached in some obscure village in England. Nobody in the New World would know anything about it. Well, anyway, the Meiklejohn he lost a lot of support among the regulators after preaching this sermon. Then regulator unrest turned violent in 1770 when the regulators attacked the court in Hillsborough. They beat up judges, lawyers, other county officials, including Edmund Fanning, who was a good friend of Governor Tryon. You've probably all seen the historical mark of Edmund Fanning up on Churton Street. Anyway, in the next year, Tryon sent another militia to Orange County to confront the regulators, and the regulators stood their ground and were routed in the Battle of Alamance Creek. Some of the regulators, quite a lot of them, fled. Some were captured, some were pardoned, and some were hanged. Apparently, 6 of them were hanged. They were found guilty of treason in a trial and were hanged, according to tradition, right out here between St. Matthew's and the Board of Education. Again, there's a historical marker for the regulators in town. Well, Hillsborough, there's a question that historians love to debate. And I don't know, I'm not an expert in this field. I don't have a dog in the fight, but was the regulator movement a precursor to the American Revolution? I mean, the resistance to royal authority. Those who say it wasn't maintain that the regulators weren't trying to overthrow the government of England, the royal government. They were just trying to get some concessions to their demands. But anyway, that's another debate for another forum. In any event, the colonies would be at war with England in just a few years later. And within just a few years, by the mid-1770s, the royal government was crumbling and the Anglican Church was in disarray. Well, Hillsborough and St. Matthew's figured prominently during the American Revolution. In August of 1775, Governor Joseph Martin fled and royal government collapsed. And in the aftermath of Martin's flight, something like 184 delegates came to Hillsborough and met in St. Matthew's Church to declare war against England and to participate to establish a government that could govern in place of the royal authority. They established a council for administrative questions. They established a legislature to replace the old royal legislature. They established a committee of public safety, which was the Colonial Committee of Public Safety. Administered this. There were 6 military districts in North Carolina, and the Committee of Public Safety administered those military districts, raised troops to fight against the English. The record says 184 people attended this conference. I wonder, where did they sleep? Where did they eat? Where did they drink? In Hillsborough at that time. I know of at least one tavern operated, well, actually owned later by a man named Thomas Faddis, who was one of the signers of the charter established in St. Matthew. He had a tavern up here on King Street, or in that alleyway off of King Street. Anyway, and there's mention of several other smaller taverns, but I still have a hard time imagining very many taverns in a town this small. But anyway, that's what the record says. And the third provincial Congress. This was the 184 delegates were attending the third provincial Congress. It set up this governmental structure for Orange County in the aftermath of the collapse of royal government. During the Revolution and in its aftermath, the legislature of North Carolina met in Hillsborough at St. Matthews in 1780, 1782, 1783, and 1784. So basically, Hillsborough was the colonial capital of North Carolina. Although there was no clergy in Hillsborough during and in the aftermath of the Revolution, Mickle John, as we'll see in a minute, left Hillsborough, even though there was no permanent rector or ministers in Hillsborough. There were religious services held in Hillsborough from itinerant ministers, including most famously Francis Asbury, the famous Methodist missionary. Asbury visited Hillsborough on 4 different occasions, and he's been often quoted. We'll see in just a second. But on his first visit in 1780, Asbury preached at the residence and tavern of William Courtney. His tavern is the Yellow House on King Street, right up around the corner. And Asbury remarked on that occasion that the people were decent and behaved well. On the second occasion in 1783, and this is a quote that is most often cited in sort of official Episcopal literature, Asbury noted that he had a large congregation. I walked to the church, that is the original St. Matthew's. I walked to the church. It was once an elegant building and still makes a good impression at a distance, but within it is ruins. And then on the third and fourth visits to Hillsborough, Asbury was not quite so complimentary. I haven't seen any Chamber of Commerce literature quoting the third and fourth occasions. On the third visit in 1784, he wrote, "The snow was deep, the street dirty, the people drinking and swearing." On his final visit in 1786, he wrote, "I met a cool reception. I am now satisfied never to visit that place again until they have a desire to see me." Oh, what a country this is. Anyway, in the 1780s, mid-1780s, the church was repurposed as a Hillsborough Academy. In 1788, a constitutional convention was held in this declining church. The assembly voted not to ratify the Constitution that had been proposed by the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia. It was in the following year. What the delegates that year wanted was a Bill of Rights, and once the Bill of Rights, once work began to attach a Bill of Rights, then North Carolina ratified the Constitution the following year in Fayetteville. One tradition says that the church burned up. Court records, however, say that the vacant church building was in such ruinous and decayed situation and has not for a number of years been used as a place of worship, that it was put up for sale and demolished. Well, what happened to Mickle John during the Revolution? He remained a loyalist. He was captured by revolutionists in the Battle of Moores Creek. How many know where Moores Creek is? If you drive down to Wilmington or Wrightsville Beach on Interstate 40, you'll pass the exit for Battle of Moores Creek, which is a national historical monument. Anyway, Mickle John was captured there. He was exiled to Perquimans County. I can imagine exile to Perquimans County was anyway, not a very, he fortunately got pardoned, paroled, I guess is a better word. He was paroled and he wound up living in Granville County. A good friend of his was one of the regulators of Patriot and Revolutionary General Person. And Mickle John lived on his property for a while and then moved up to Mecklenburg County in Virginia, where he died in 1817, or maybe 1818. Again, one of those mysteries. After Mickle John left, during the Revolution, when he left in 1776, there would be no rector in St. Matthew's until 1825, when St. Matthew's was reestablished. There was no organized Episcopal church in the aftermath of the Revolution. Several of the rectors got together in 1790 and tried to, they wrote a constitution for an Episcopal diocese in North Carolina, and they elected Charles Pettigrew down in Edenton as bishop, but he had to go to Philadelphia to be consecrated. And he got on board ship and got to Norfolk, learned that there was a virulent outbreak of typhoid fever or some such disease, and he turned back and never got to Philadelphia to be consecrated. Why he never went to the next triennial convention is he just didn't go. Not really an explanation given. So North Carolina was without a diocese and without a bishop until the diocese established in 1817, and Ravenscroft was elected bishop in 1823. So from 1776 to 1825, St. Matthew's Parish was without a rector. Of course, in 2431, Episcopalians, or at least 31 residents of Hillsborough in Orange County, signed the charter to establish St. Matthew's. And that's an event that we'll be celebrating on St. Matthew's Day in the fall of this year, when all of you will be invited to recreate that event and sign a charter committing yourself to support St. Matthew's Parish and Church. And so I think that's going to be a very nice event. and very appropriate for our bicentennial triennium. Thank you. Jordan. Anybody have any questions? Yeah.
Was Africa the guy that started?
Yeah.
Now, was his partner black?
No.
Oh my gosh. The guy, he should have figured out that Africa was with that name.
Well, former slave. I mean, yeah. I mean, it's yes. No. You know that's about as much as we know. But yes, a fascinating story, and obviously, Africa Parker had learned. He probably learned the art and the mystery of distilling while working on whoever. Well, Kane purchased Africa Parker, I think about a year before he petitioned the court to have him free. I forget the name of the family that had originally owned Africa, but it's obviously with them that he had learned how to distill. And it's an example of slaves who had a lot of skills, including those ones who helped build St. Matthew's Church, bricklayers, woodworkers, the roofers. Yeah, I mean, some of them had very valuable skills. Mr. Hancock, who was the contractor who built this church, employed and made the bricks. Well, he didn't make them. I mean, the slaves he hired made bricks, and those slaves that he owned, who became very accomplished at bricklaying, for example, he would free them. They would earn their manumission working skillfully for Mr. Hancock for however many years he thought necessary. Yeah.
I just wanted to add, popped up, the Presbyterian Church that sits on the St. Matthew's site.
Yes.
Celebrated their 200th in 1816.
Right.
16.
Right.
So.
And communicants here wanted that lot back. In fact, it was ours rightful. That lot was ours rightfully by law. The legislature said that any property owned by a church prior to the Revolution belonged to that church. And so we had a legal right to that property. Judge Thomas Ruffin argued against that and convinced the communicants not to pursue that line. He said, it's just going to cause too much. It's just going to cause stress and animosity, and people are going to get mad at each other. And he then gave us the land to build on. So,
was it true that some of the Presbyterians let the Episcopals worship in their church?
yeah, this was common. St. Matthew, the original St. Matthew's was really yes, it was a church, but it was also a public building for civic affairs, as well as being available to ministers of other religions. That's where Asbury would preach. There or Courtney's Tavern. But if there was a conflict, the Episcopalians would have dibs on the church. But it was open for them. And I assume, and The Presbyterian Church, I think, was formed by public subscription as well. I mean, wasn't just their money, it was public funds that also helped build the church. So, yeah,
As regards the alcoholic beverages, I read that the early settlers had found out that water would make them sick. So they imbibed quite a lot, and even children, they were alcohol drinkers. Big time.
could be. It could be. I don't know. I don't know about the purity of the water. I suspect it was less contaminated then than it is now. Yeah, well, I mean, with cattle roaming around and drinking out of streams and agricultural runoff and anyway, I think I'd have taken my chances then rather than now. Anything else?
I was just gonna ask, how did the Episcopalians stay organized enough from the time John left to then form the current church?
Well,
I mean, they
They
were
were
still
like-
worshiping, and I mean, how did they even stay?
I should have mentioned, I mean, like St. Mary's continued. St. Mary's would not have been flourishing during that period particularly, but it was there, and there will be,
Because I was wondering if you even wanted to admit you were an Episcopalian after the revolution. You know,
well, that was a lot of it, you know, there was that. I mean, of course, it would have been pretty well known in this community who the Episcopalians were. I mean, they were mainly the elite. And
the landowners.
the big landowners, sure. But what's her name? Jean Anderson, in her history of Durham, refers to one of the I guess it's the wife of Duncan Cameron, talks about Cain's Chapel. And she mentions an Episcopal rector coming through Orange County, stopping by and visiting with the Cameron family, and made his way to Cain's Chapel. And I asked Brooks if he knew what is Cain's Chapel. His guess is that it was St. Mary's. That because the Cain family is close by the Cain property, and it would have, the Cains, this would have been William Sr., probably, who would have supported the chapel.
Did the Church of England still have authority over the church here? I mean, who was over?
No, I mean, let's say the church here did not accept the authority of the Church of England. None. Well, the authority was that in order to become a bishop in the Episcopal Church, you had to be consecrated by the Bishop of London. And in order for the Bishop of London to say, okay, I'll consecrate you, a bishop would have to, and rectors would have to swear an oath of allegiance to the monarchy, which they couldn't do. And so the Episcopal Church in the United States went to Scotland and got Seabury was the first Episcopal bishop in the United States. And he had to go to Scotland to be consecrated, which was not recognized by the Church of England. So, no, I mean, and then Seabury could come back and then he could consecrate other bishops.
Keep the apostolic succession.
Yeah, so you're right. I mean, we had to maintain that line of apostolic succession. So the Scots helped us out. I don't know whether Meiklejohn had a hand in that or not. Anyway,
Thank you.
okay, thank you.
Auburn,
Okay.
Alabama.
You sure are. How are you doing, below?
What relation are you, Frank? All right, so
Ex-husband.
wireless. There you go.
She's deceased.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, we divorced early in 2000.
I don't even. How long have you been up here? Sounds like for a long time.